Good evening and welcome back to Magic the Judging. Once again, I'm David Lyford-Smith, and this week we are going to be talking about team events. And particularly, we're going to be talking about team trios, which is very much at the forefront of the kind of Magic mind right now, as we've got Grand Prix San Jose this weekend, which marks a return for trios sealed deck after a very long absence from Grand Prix. And we're also going to be talking a little bit about trios constructed and, of course, about two-headed giant. I want to, however, start off this week's episode with a little bit of a chat on debriefing last week's topic, as always. Last week we talked about triggered abilities, what they are, where they come from, and how they work both in the rules and in policy. In particular, I wanted to draw everybody's attention to a really interesting discussion that's currently going on the judge list regarding Soul Tithe. Soul Tithe is a enchant creature from Return to Ravnica that grants which basically triggers in your opponent's upkeep. You put it on your opponent's creature, it triggers in their upkeep and makes them sacrifice it unless they pay its converted mana cost in the form of colorless mana. This is something which is a little unusual, and in particular because previous cards in this ilk have, in this mold, have kind of tended to grant that ability to the creature rather than just trigger itself. I'm not going to prejudice or go into the discussion too much because I think the best thing for everybody to do really is to head to the judge list. Original post is by Irish Level 2 Mark McGovern. See what he's got to say about it and see what people are saying because it's only just come up today, and I think it's a really interesting discussion and a kind of really nice, interesting case to think about for the new triggered abilities policy and how it's going to cope with that. So that's triggered abilities. Now we're going to move on to talking about the main topic for today, which is team event. As I mentioned last week, tomorrow I am actually getting on board a plane and flying to San Jose, California, and the reason being is that I am actually competing as a member of a team in Grand Prix San Jose this weekend. That's obviously a pretty expensive trip, but it's my main holiday for Magic for the year, and for me, there is no better way of enjoying competitive Magic the Gathering than team events. They are great fun, whether competitive or casual. Most of my best memories of playing Magic competitively come from playing in competitive events past in team formats. I can remember when we had team sealed PTQs reasonably frequently, and team sealed was something that came up at Grand Prix every so often, and it was just awesome. And I'm really happy to see Wizards experiment with bringing it back. And particularly, I'm happy to see that we're likely to see a really positive, high uptake on this, leading into already we've had confirmed that we're going to get another one of these. Team Sealed will also be the format for Gatecrash Sealed at GP Utrecht in the Netherlands in March of 2013. So I really love team events. I'm going to talk to you about them, how they work, how judging them works, and kind of discuss some of the both rules and policy topics that kind of come up when you are involved with team events. So let's start with Trio Sealed, as that is no doubt what is at the forefront of my mind right now. Trio Sealed is a format where a team of 3 players receives 12 boosters. Every team has to receive the same booster mix, just like in regular sealed deck. And from those 12 boosters, has to construct 3 separate decks for the 3 separate players. Unlike Two-Headed Giant, Trios is not a multiplayer format, it is a team format, but each player is playing an individual game against an individual opponent. You have to build those 3 decks and assign yourselves arbitrary letters A, B, and C, which you then are stuck with for the rest of the tournament. You are then going to be paired player A against player A, player B against player B, player C against player C, against another team. What you will then do is each of you plays your match in the normal ways you might do in an individual tournament, but instead of just your match score being your score, your team score will be the aggregate of the 3 matches you're playing. So, for example, if I in seat A win my match and my colleague in seat B wins their match, we've won the match at least 2-1, possibly 3-0, depending on the outcome of match C. Of course, this does mean you can win all of your matches and never win a round, and vice versa, you can lose all your matches and still win all your rounds, because your performance is not entirely hooked onto yourself, it is also carried by your 2 teammates. Team Sealed deck, because you are playing individual matches as well as building 3 decks, players also are required to build a assign cards that they've opened to a particular sideboard. And when it comes to doing team deck checks, this is something to consider. There will generally be a deck registration sheet on which the entire pool of all 12 boosters worth of cards has been registered, and then they will then be building individual decks. Usually, I would recommend using a separate deck registration sheet, because otherwise the deck registration sheets tend to get quite cumbersome. If you imagine having a column A main deck, column A sideboard, deck and player B main deck, player B sideboard, it just doesn't work. A better plan is just to use 4 separate deck registration sheets, 1 for the pool and then 3 for each of the 3 players. So one of the first things to think about is, if you're judging one of these events, is how you're going to do deck checks. You could think about if you want to just deck check a particular player, or if you want to deck check an entire team match. So, for example, do you want to just deck check seat B in this particular match, or are you going to set up your deck checks team so that you are deck checking seats A, B, and C all at the same time? Extra time is not a particular issue in trios events. You can just give it to one match separately from the other 2. You don't need to worry about the fact that they are not going to have the same round clock. But it's something that I think is important. Deck registration in general, and the recommended time, if you look it up, and I do recommend looking it up. I had to look it up. I have no idea. Recommended time for trios sealed deck building is about an hour. It's something that takes substantially more time than building an individual sealed deck, not only because you've obviously got to do more of it, because you do have more people. What really takes the time is the discussion, the fact that you can't just internally quickly go through the thought processes and come to a conclusion. You're in a situation where you've got to wait for people, and you've got to discuss with people and validate and kind of justify your decisions. When you do get to the deck checking, of course, then you have to check that each player has to have assigned the cards which they're not playing in their main deck to a sideboard of a particular deck. And so another thing you are generally thinking about if you're judging a trio sealed event is making sure that the players have stuck to that assignment that they were given, that they set up at the beginning of the day. Strategically speaking, the assignment of sideboards in this format is really, really important. So there is definitely opportunity for people to make a mistake, to get this wrong, and therefore to be tempted, if they don't think anyone's going to look, to swap those sideboard cards which are really needed in their buddy's deck into their buddy's deck, and assume that nobody's going to see it and nobody's going to worry about it. So that's a kind of a hot button for Team Seal Deck. Speaking about Team Seal Deck a little bit more, the other thing that I wanted to kind of discuss on this is to open one of the big cans of worms in team events, which is communication. Communication as a whole is very much one of the key differences in Team Seal Deck between how it works in normal situations and how it works in trios. In any kind of team event, the members of a team are allowed to communicate with one another. They can talk to each other freely. They can communicate secretly, and they can share information and strategy. But there are a couple of limits to that, and these are other things to watch out for whilst you're judging one of these events. For example, they're not allowed to use written communication. And the reason for that is because we don't allow external prepared notes in a match. It's very difficult to separate written communication that the players are sharing that they've just made in the match now with, it's hard to separate that from written notes that they've prepared beforehand and which are therefore not allowed. So the blanket rule there is that they're not allowed to use any kind of written communication. You are allowed to use any language you wish, or any kind of coded language you want. Of course, if you don't want your opposing team members to figure out what your potential strategy discussions are about, which generally speaking you don't, you are going to want to talk in vague terms and so on and so forth. And that's normal competitive behavior that we expect to see from players in these kinds of events, so that's okay, but written communication is out. The other thing that's important about communication is players, whilst they are allowed to talk to each other, do have to keep within the usual slow play kind of limits. They have to consider the fact that the round clock is not any longer just because they're playing a team format versus a normal format, and therefore they have to make sure that they are still progressing their matches in a reasonable fashion. Particularly if the players that are discussing things, if all of the games are still active, i.e. none of the matches are finished, you are stopping 2 or even 3 games to make this discussion about what play is correct, etc., etc. We do allow people to have those discussions, but they need to be succinct to the point. They need to happen and then finish. They can't hold up the entire tournament just to have a in-depth 5-minute analysis of what the correct play is. Another thing that is important is that talking about leaving the playing area. Players aren't allowed to generally leave the playing area to discuss things while their match is still ongoing, mostly for logistical reasons, as you will end up with little pockets of players all over the place, and it's very difficult to monitor what anybody is saying or doing in any of those seats. Obviously, if a player has finished their match, they are not required to stay with their 2 teammates. If they want to, they are allowed to leave. But an important extra rule is that once a player has left the play area where those 3 matches are happening, then they're not allowed to then come back. The reason is it's very easy for them to discreetly circle round the back, check out what's in the hand of all of the opposing players, and then come back and share that information with their teammates in some subtle fashion. Therefore, you have to make sure that people know that it's not acceptable. They have to, if they choose to leave, they've left permanently, they can't come back. These are not necessarily things that people are going to be aware of. These are fairly unusual rules to be enforced, and they are buried in the Magic Tournament rules. So if you do run a team event, particularly a competitive one, but a team event in general, I would definitely take some of your head judge speech, or if you are the head judge, to make sure that this kind of topic is covered. Discuss what's allowed and what's not allowed, explain it, and then hopefully players will have a better idea of what they can and can't do and are less likely to get themselves in trouble unintentionally. So that's a little introduction to Team Sealed. I really wanted to quickly touch on constructed trios. Again, this is not something that has been sanctioned at competitive for a while, outside of occasionally being seen in World Championships and the World Magic Cup. But team constructed events work in a similar fashion in terms of communication and setup, but there are a couple of interesting deck building things which, if you choose to run one of these events at regular, and I do encourage these, like team events are great fun and people really enjoy them, but there's 2 basic ways you can do this. Method 1 is what I think of as the world style, because it was what was used in the World Championships for many, many years, which is where each of the 3 seats plays a different constructed format. Traditionally, it always used to be that we'd have a block standard and extended player, or a block standard and legacy player, and these days it's generally a block standard and a modern player. Those are generally the kind of things that are set up. Particularly, I wanted to mention how excellent that format is to get lesser played formats supported at your local playing area. If you've got a small group of legacy players, for example, who can never really get to play legacy in a tournament, running a team event where one of the people on that team is going to be playing legacy means that you can support legacy at a tournament level, but without needing everyone to have legacy decks. Only a third of people need to have legacy decks. See also modern if modern isn't highly played in your area. And so it's a good way of letting people play their pet formats, same thing with block, without having to make everybody play the pet format, and gets the kind of benefit of the team event and the camaraderie and the fun. So the second one is what was once a PTQ format, which I remember very well, in fact, which is where all 3 players play the same format, and generally we're talking standard. If you're using that format, then there's an additional rule which you may have heard of called unified deck construction. That rule basically says that the 3 decks, if you stack them on top of one another, the resulting pile would have to be standard legal. What that means is that there is only 4 of each standard card available between the 3 players. So if one guy wants to play, for example, 4 Niv Mizzet, no one else can play any. If one guy is playing his 4 cancels, no one else can play any. And that's main deck and sideboards in total. And the intention of that rule is to force some diversification into the format and to make it so that people are in a position where they have to branch out and try different things. It is only relevant when all 3 players are playing the same format in the kind of block standard and X mixed format that we talked about earlier, that does not apply, and therefore isn't relevant. If for some reason you're doing vintage, of course, if you're doing trios vintage, I mean, if you are, please tweet and tell me about it, because that sounds great. But if you're doing trios vintage, restricted cards, again, you could only have one across the 3 decks. So you've got to think carefully about where you want to spend your restricted cards. So that's a little bit of an introduction to trios. What I'm going to tackle now is the beast that is Two-Headed Giant. Two-Headed Giant was once upon a time a strictly casual format that had no kind of official recognition. At some point, Wizards brought it into the comprehensive rules and into the tournament structure as something that could be sanctioned, could be run. And for a little while, they experimented with running it as a competitive format. There was a PTQ season in the format, there were a couple of GPs, and there was a Pro Tour in the format as well. And as it turns out, Two-Headed Giant is not a great fit for competitive because the cards in sets generally aren't designed with Two-Headed Giant heavily in mind. And as a result of which, it's not really on the kind of competitive radar any longer. But it is still one of the most popular casual formats, and that's because, just like in the case of trios, team formats have that excellent casual atmosphere, real camaraderie, and I know many places that run Two-Headed Giant pre-releases or other casual Two-Headed Giant events to good effect. I'm pretty much only going to be talking about Two-Headed Giant limited formats here. Two-Headed Giant Constructed is possible, but it's extremely unusual. I only know of 1 or 2 instances of it ever having been run by people that I've met, and it generally doesn't work all that well. So I'm just going to focus on Two-Headed Giant sealed deck and then a little bit of discussion of Two-Headed Giant draft. So of course, there are 2 clear delineations between trios and Two-Headed Giant. The obvious one is that you have 2 players instead of 3, but the other thing is that it is a multiplayer format. You are all playing the same game. All 4 players are involved in a single game of Magic, which is different from trios, where each player is still playing their own individual match. It's just that their tournament score is considered in net with others. Two-Headed Giant, as a whole, first of all, I want to talk about, actually, the number 1 resource here is the Two-Headed Giant FAQ. If you haven't read this document, it's really good. It's only a few pages long, and it gives you an introduction to pretty much all of the common questions about the format, including some which I'm not going to have the time to discuss today. To get that document, as well as any of the documents, what you need to do is go to thedci.com/docs. That is the document center, and that is where all of the up-to-date penalty guidelines, tournament rules, Two-Headed Giant FAQ, sealed deck registration sheets, all that kind of stuff is kept. And it's kept up to date at all times, so that's where to go for it. So Two-Headed Giant is a team format. The players play on a team with simultaneous turns and with some shared resources. Particularly what they do is they share their life total, which starts at 30 instead of 20, and there was at the time many years ago where it was 40, so you may still run into some players who are under the impression that it's 40. It's not. 30 life. So you share that. You share your turn in that you play through the steps and phases of your turn in lockstep with one another. And you can also share information between one another as well. You are therefore in a position to, again, cooperate with one another, but other than the things I just talked about, largely each player still has their own hand, their own library, and their own permanents, and lands can only tap for their spells, and so on and so forth. It does have a couple of wrinkles, and I know Two-Headed Giant does come up on rules exams sometimes, so I do want to talk about a couple of Two-Headed Giant rules concepts. So let's talk first of all about the rule stuff, and then we're going to come on to the policy stuff and the tournament operation stuff. So rules. Two-Headed Giant, as I said, uses a shared turn. Furthermore, as a multiplayer format, it also includes a single free mulligan, and by free what I mean is the first mulligan that each player chooses to take. If they choose to take one, they go from 7 back to 7 again, and then further mulligans work in the usual way down to 6, 5, 4, 3, and so on. In terms of how that works in the game, all 4 players have to come to a decision and then simultaneously announce and enact their decision. Once somebody has made their decision to mulligan or not mulligan, they're then stuck into that. What you can't do is keep your hand, then see that your opposing team is mulliganing a lot, and then decide you actually want to take that free mulligan to another 7 after all. Once you've decided to stick, you're stuck. The other thing which has changed in the rules, and it's changed again quite a few years ago, but it's something that I still hear sometimes, is the play-draw rule. It's just a bigger version of the normal 2-player play-draw rule. The team that is playing first do not draw cards. The team that is playing second both draw a card. There used to be a time where it was not quite like that, and it's not anymore. It's very simple. The first team doesn't draw, second team does. Then we move on to the final kind of more common thing in Two-Headed Giant, which is attacking and blocking. Combat in general. Because the 2 players share their turn structure, they have a single declare attacker step in which they will declare all the creatures they want to attack with between them in a single big attack. They're also not attacking a specific head of the opposing team, a specific player. They're just attacking with all of their combined forces as they wish. Similarly, blocking is done with a single declare blocker step by the defending team. Everybody puts their guys in front in whatever way they want, but it's a single thing. There's no particular significance to whether I'm sitting directly across from somebody or diagonally across from them. There's no particular relevance there. You can block across and mix it up as you want. Where it does come for separation is in terms of when combat damage is dealt. When things are actually assigning combat damage, if they're unblocked, at that point the rules say that the controlling players should be deciding whether they want to have that damage dealt to head A or head B. 99% of the time that isn't important. There is actually a tournament shortcut that says if they don't say otherwise, then the damage is defaulting to be assigned to the primary head, which is the player sat on the right, who has the right of final say if the 2 players disagree on what they should do strategically. And then the head on the right is given the slight authority in that, so that they don't just get themselves into a deadlock. So that is a little bit of a look at the basics of Two-Headed Giant rules. So I want to discuss a couple of other topics which people frequently ask or get stuck on. A popular thing to ask about is life totals, and this one changed much more recently. There used to be some horrible business about halving and distributing life totals between players. It was very complicated, and it doesn't happen anymore. The current Two-Headed Giant rules say if some effects cares about a player's life total, you just use the team's life total instead. And what that means is that if, for example, you have an effect that says your life total becomes 10, it means your team life total becomes 10. Very simple. Sorin Markov, under the old rules, if you used his target opponent's life total becomes 10 ability, did not do at all what anybody would have expected it to do intuitively. It was an attempt to kind of make those cards scaled properly, and it didn't work. What we have now is simpler. It doesn't mean some cards are much better or much worse than they would otherwise be, but it's simpler. Another common thing is talking about things which say each player. You do still have 4 players. You are connected in that you are playing as a team, but you are still 4 individual people. You're 4 players, which means that anything that says each player does X or deal damage to each player is going to do it per head. For example, if you have Gutter Snipe from Return to Ravnica says whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, it deals 2 damage to each opponent. You have 2 opposing players, 2 opponents, it will deal 2 damage to each of them, resulting in a deduction of 4 from their team life total. I think that's probably a little kind of blitz through the Two-Headed Giant rules and the most common questions. I also want to actually quickly emphasize another one, which is less likely to come up now that we have Return to Ravnica in our hands, but did come up for a little while on M13, while I remember. Exalted. Exalted sucks in Two-Headed Giant. This is why. An exalted creature says, whenever a creature you control attacks alone, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. First problem is it only affects creatures you control, and as I said earlier, there are 2 separate players here, each of whom controls their own creatures, their own permanents. So if I have an exalted creature, let's say for example I have a Knight of Glory, it will only trigger on my creatures attacking, not my other head, my teammates' creatures attacking. The second part is attacking alone. Unfortunately, alone does mean alone, and it counts both players' creatures. So what this means is that if, for example, the Knight of Glory attacks and any other creature attacks either mine or my teammates, the exalted trigger isn't going to happen. Therefore, to a giant, you'll find that, as a rule, exalted triggers much less often and is generally much worse. So a little kind of reminder of the way that things work in two-headed giant. So tournaments. Two-headed giant sealed deck is by far and away the most common, using the same kind of ratios as trios, where if you recall from earlier we discussed that a trios team gets 12 boosters, i.e. 4 boosters per player. We also give 4 boosters per player to a two-headed giant sealed deck team, and therefore that each team will receive 8 boosters. Those 8 boosters, again, they need to use for 2 decks. What they don't need to worry about is sideboard assignment, and the reason for that is that two-headed giant events are best of 1 rather than best of 3. Games in two-headed giant do definitely tend to go on longer, and as a result, the format is first to 1 rather than the usual first to 3. If a game becomes a draw and a second game is necessary, then they can dip into their kind of pooled sideboard as necessary, but it's very unusual. Those decks then, usual deck construction rules, have to stick with their players. Again, they have to assign themselves as primary and secondary player. Primary player sits on the right and has that right of veto that we discussed earlier, that kind of overruling power. And that is basically that. And an important thing to note is that if either player loses the game, both players lose the game, and this is very relevant in the case of decking or milling. If one player runs out of cards and tries to draw a card from an empty library, that will kill the whole team. And therefore, decking is a very powerful strategy in two-headed giant because you only need to kill one player with it, but you have 2 players worth of resources to make it happen. I want to talk a little bit about some other judging issues you might see. Now, first of all, two-headed giant will be regular rel, so we're not going to discuss competitive two-headed giant here. What you are likely to see in two-headed giant, like in trios, is things will slow down. Players are going to be talking for a very long time, and unlike in trios where the people kind of giving advice have their own match to get on with, they have nothing else to do but discuss things. Therefore, things will tend to slow down, discussions can go on for very long, and things can kind of get stalled. So it's again important to emphasize that message of, even at regular rel, there is a time limit and you need to attempt to finish your match. Even though you're only playing one match in your 50 minutes, two-headed giant games do take longer and you do need to continue the game moving. And so it's one of the most important things that you are clear with your players right from the get-go about how long they can be discussing things, what's acceptable and what's not. The other thing is that the 2 players will probably not discuss everything, and there is also a discussion going on the judge list at the moment about what to do if one player is trying to progress the game and the other one is not. I believe the original was actually in terms of missing or not missing triggers, but it could go for pretty much anything. Basically, neither player has the ability to just move the game forward without the consent of the other. The primary head does have the ability to overrule the secondary head, but only in cases where they've directly disagreed about things, not just in general. What we're not talking about here is if let's say the secondary player wants to cast a spell in the post-combat main phase, and the primary player, as soon as combat is over, says, okay, and go, that isn't going to work. If the second player goes, whoa, stop, I had a spell, that's fine, they can cast their spell. The priority pass hasn't happened yet. The primary-secondary thing exists because if they actually disagree about whether they should cast that spell or not, if they should save it or not, then the primary head has the final say in the case that they really can't settle the discussion themselves. So that is what that is for. Is not the case that whatever the primary player says goes and the secondary player is just there to manipulate cards and that has no other purpose. So two-headed giant tournaments and team tournaments in general, I want to kind of point out a couple of common pitfalls for starting players. Starting judges and players both, sorry. One thing to think about when you're setting up for one of these events is thinking about how your table numbers are going to work. You will generally be looking at a different kind of setup for your table numbers for a team event than you would be for a regular event. You might think about having your numbers, instead of sort of here with the player sat here and here, you might want to put it this way. So for example, this could be a table tent which has 40 on it, and you want both members of that team to sit on the table 40 side, and the others on the table 39 side, because of course the team members need to be sat next to one another, facing their opponents on the other side of the table. So that's something to think about very early on. Another kind of common thing that people don't think about when they start running these events is how they work in terms of Wizard Event Reporter. I'm no werewolf. I don't know lots about Wizard Event Reporter, but I can tell you that if you're going to be entering these kinds of things, you will need to put in some sort of a team name. That at regular L, if your players want to have kind of flavorful, fun, cheeky team names, that's fine. If people abuse that, take it away from them. If people are making things which are abusive or offensive or unpleasant, just don't allow people to choose their own team names. Just use player surnames. At competitive REL, that's what is the policy. You just use the player surnames because it makes things clearer and simpler to understand. If you really want to have people the ability to choose their own team names, what I really think is a good idea, and I've used in some quizzes that I've run and things, is just let them pick a team name, but say that the team name has to be a magic card. Everybody knows the names of some magic cards, so nobody's going to be disadvantaged with not being able to choose something. And because they have to choose a magic card, it will restrict it to not being something that's offensive or inappropriate for a tournament setting. So there's a kind of good shortcut for getting that through. Two-headed giant of 4 eyes, by the way, tends to go quite quickly if you run a two-headed giant tournament, I would expect, as it directly references the format. Two-headed dragon also goes quite quickly. So that's a couple of the things which I wanted to talk about in terms of how two-headed giant tournaments work, what makes them a little bit different. I think we're kind of coming to a close on the topic, and I am intending to have this week's episode be a little shorter, because I do have packing to do, I've got practice to do, I've got 1,000 things to do. So what I'm going to do is going to just wrap up on the kind of team events, first of all, with a little bit of a retrospective of the key points. So key points, team events are fun. If you can run them in your local area, if you are a TO, or if your TO is amenable to running something a little different at some point, do so. They're great fun. Secondly, they do require a little bit of extra preparation. Do make sure you look up the latest documents, make sure you read up on the formats, and make sure you understand the likely questions. Third key point, make sure that if you are giving a starting announcement for the day, make sure that that covers some of the unusual things that your players are less likely to know. And fourthly, please do make sure that you watch out for communication and play speed, as these are areas which are very, very hot buttons anyway, but especially in team formats, slow play and communication policy violations are very common, whether at regular or at competitive. I also want to just again stress a little point about the regular schedule. Tuesdays, of course, not our regular night. The regular time going forward is going to be Thursdays at 7 p.m. British time. That means that I will be coming to you again in 9 days' time after my return from my return to Ravnica in GP San Jose. The topic at that time is going to be our first fully rules discussion. We're going to be talking about mana costs and what everything to do with the mana cost and the cost and what it means. That's going to be the topic in 9 days' time on the 18th of October. Then we will be hopefully hitting a regular schedule Thursdays at 7, and I will therefore hopefully be seeing you again on the 25th of October. But for updates to the schedule, as well as any kind of comments, suggestions, and so forth, if you do have anything, then just hit up at Magic the Judging on Twitter, and that will go to my producer, Gareth Tanner, who will be able to help me out. Or you can just come to me directly at Savia Wanderer and tell me what you think, if you have any ideas, and check me out there. That's all we've got for this week. Your little bit of homework for this week is to let me know if you have run a constructed two-headed giant event, or if you know of one that was run, tell me what it was about and how it worked. I'd love to hear it. I've only ever heard of a couple, and they were pretty combo heavy, so let me know if that was your experience. Last week's homework, by the way, I asked people to find default actions that were not beneficial. Nobody could. So not as in but default actions which weren't just sacrificing or doing something bad is what I mean. So that's everything I've got for this week's episode. Thank you very much for tuning in, and I will see you again in 9 days' time on the 18th of October.